So we've wired our brim, and we've also wired the tip and then whip stitched it on to the side band. Now we're going to cover it with some bias, which smooths out the wires and also adds a place for you to stitch the covering to. That way you don't have to poke all the way through the layers of buckram every time. Bias should be nice and flat and not all nasty. That'll show up in your hat. You want to also join the bias if you think you're going to need a bit more to get around, especially the brim, because it takes quite a bit to get around. You always start right at the center back, and you sit the bias so it's about halfway over the fold. Now this bias is cut about 2.5 centimeters wide. That way you've got a bit of wiggle room. I'm going to start at the center back and pin 1 or 2 pins to hold. I can get a hold of a pin. There we go. So you just pop a pin in there to hold that. I'll use my thimble to push it through. Okay. Now you want to give the bias a tug so that it kind of sucks up over the edge and it'll lie flat. You can see that's sitting there nice and flat. Same with down here. So you give it a little tug. That's the glory of bias. Oops. I give it too much of a tug. Let's give it a tug. Pop a pin in there again to hold it in place. And continue around your hat. I'm just going to stop there so I can show you what comes next. So you want to make sure that's nice and snug and even. I've pulled it a bit too high there. So I'm going to make sure. And there's nothing wrong with putting more pins in. You just don't want to poke yourself when you're working. Okay. So the idea is that it's laying against the buckram. It's not distorting anything. It's just living in there. So then you want to stitch it in place. And this requires you to get your hand up inside your hat. I'm just using a different color so that you can see what I'm up to. And I would probably bury my thread so it's on the wrong side of the hat. Okay, there we go. Take a stitch. Now, you don't want to stitch too close to the wire. You want to stitch a little ways down. Just makes your life easier and you're not going to get caught up in the wire, and you're also not going to sort of show it off. You're trying to hide it. So we're going to do more of a back stitch to hold this in, because you don't want it to let go, especially if you're going to use it as a platform for your cover. So a back stitch, you go back on itself. And this can be a bit tedious because you have to go in and out. Okay, and then the back stitch, it comes out in front of, oops, it's hard to hold it and show it at the same time, in front of the stitch you just made. And then you go back. And it should be enough to hold it securely and keep everything nice and smooth. And far enough away from the wire that it's not going to interfere with it, and it's not going to flip up the bias tape. So you continue that all the way around. And then you would repeat it for the tip, stitching the bias. Oop. up on your tip. Same thing, a back stitch to hold it. It's a bit awkward to demo, so forgive me if it's a bit wobbly. You're aiming for nice and straight and purty. Okay. Big back stitch to hold it in place. It's very hard to sew when you can't see. There we go. Okay. So I'm sure you get the idea that you want to make sure this is nice and snug, that the tape is secure so you can actually sew onto it. And of course you want it to be nice and even and not higgledy-piggledy. So that is finishing the edge of the wire. Also, if you sew it in the color of the garment, it's not quite so ugly. The thread will fray out with the buckram, so be prepared for that little bit of annoyance. But it's well worth doing because it's nice and slick, and it makes it look professional. All right, so we've finished that edge. Now you do the same process with the brim, and you start at the center back, same way. And the same thing, you want to make sure that the bias tape is pulled nice and snug over the edge, half and half of your brim. Some folks machine this. If you can get in there, maybe with a zipper foot, then go for it. It could be a bit awkward. Depends on the shape of your brim. This one you probably could get at it by machine. I'm just going to stick some pins in there. You don't want to get too close to the wire though, because that defeats the purpose of it. You're trying to disguise the bias here, so you can see it. You're trying to disguise that bias. Okay, so if you're going to machine it, then you want to make sure you're at the edge of the bias and not too close to the wire. So when you get to the end, and I recommend you swag some pins in here. I just want to go around the edge to show you what happens. When you get to the end, you want to overlap it about an inch so that it's nice and smooth. You don't need to turn anything under its bias. It's going to be inside the cover. So you just want to overlap it a little bit at the edge end of things here. Okay, so same thing, you would use a nice big back stitch to go around and hold it in place, making sure it's nice and secure, and if you pull on it snug, it'll come to rest against the buckram. So nice and smooth. And then the wire is disguised. So that's that for covering the edge.